Recently, in a video here on the channel about how the Russians have been developing new drone and artificial intelligence technologies. And later, in another video about the Golden Dome, a colossal project from the Trump administration. This is essentially the revival of the Reagan-era Star Wars project aiming to reactivate space-based anti-missile weapons. And finally, in another video, about how Ukraine has also managed to overcome difficulties by innovating with new weapons and technologies, especially with drones. A lot of people commented that wars always end up driving technological evolution, and here I need to be clear, that's a myth. Isn't war supposed to promote more technological development? When people say that, they're thinking of two wars, the first and the second. The wars that came before and the wars that came after, if they had any technological development, it was very small. The First and Second World Wars were an exception, and why were they an exception? Because there was a large, massive national coordination around a big goal, which was to defeat the enemy. It's not that war results in technological development, it's that war serves as a kind of catalyst. It ends up unifying internal interests, the groups, setting aside differences to focus on a big goal, which is to defeat this external enemy. As well as the environment of international competition, it also ends up stimulating technological development, especially during periods of war and even in times of peace. But if on one hand, this competition stimulates, on the other hand, cooperation also stimulates, and it's important that these two forces, competition and cooperation, go hand in hand. Too much competition leads to chaos and disorder. Too much cooperation leads to complacency and stagnation. So it's these two things that ended up stimulating technological development. That's why the Cold War was a period in which we had so much development. In fact, not just the Cold War, but the period from after 1950 until 2020 was the period of greatest growth in material and immaterial wealth in the history of humanity. The amount of wealth and technological development generated in these 70 years is greater than what happened in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. Before that, because of cooperation alongside competition, and that's what we're going to look at in more detail in today's video. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. It really helps when you share. You have no idea how important your sharing is. To keep the World Geopolitics channel alive, its existence depends on you. My name is Deleon Peta, and this is the World Geopolitics channel. One thing that a lot of people don't understand is that civilizations die more from suicide than from murder, so to speak. Arnold Toynbee several decades ago made this very clear. There are few cases where a civilization is destroyed by greater external forces, especially when we talk about the great civilizations. In general, they were rotten and crumbling nations, with their neighbors being more opportunistic than necessarily skillful and strategic. And this is one of the harshest and most sobering lessons of history, but also one of the most ignored. When we think of social collapse, we usually imagine a foreign invasion, an economic collapse, or some sudden disaster. But most of the time, decline comes quietly, gradually. So gradual, in fact, that most people don't notice until it's too late. And when the crisis becomes visible, the cultural foundations will already have rotted. This rotting is the biggest and most invisible problem, and it usually starts in places where no one suspects. It doesn't happen in the streets through popular fury, or in barracks of mutinous soldiers, or in camps of hidden rebels. Events like these are the consequence, not the cause. This decay begins in places like schools, not with crowds, but with the elite and with intellectuals. Not with chaos, but with comfort. History is nothing more, nothing less than the account of how civilizations degenerated and collapsed after reaching what, at the time, were their peaks of power and prosperity. So we have to reflect not on how civilizations go into decline, but rather on what causes that decline. And repeatedly, the answer is not a lack of intelligence or resources, but the breakdown of native cultural values. Let's take the Roman Empire as an example. Rome wasn't conquered in a day, nor did it fall due to a lack of strength. Quite the opposite. Rome had wealth, power, and centuries of experience in domination, but it also had something else, and that indeed would lead to its downfall: complacency. As prosperity increased, discipline decreased, and as military power grew, moral restraint weakened. The values that built Rome, such as hard work, family, sacrifice, and civic duty, were gradually eroded by decadence. When the barbarians reached the Roman gates, Rome had already fallen from within. That's what I want you to focus on. Turco Cicero. Even though a nation may survive, government the values that, but not internal betrayal. And yet, over time, internal decay has been explained, romanticized, or even ignored, which is what we see today. They built civic structures, gradually corroded the borders of nations, or when internal tumors begin to erupt, the system is already dead. All that's left is a kick to the shins of the institution's weak legs to bring them down for good. They're already weak, but what's missing is the symbolism of their weakness. The loss of their status as a force is just the final stage of a decline. Everyone believes in the strength of such a rotten institution until the symptoms of that decay start piling up. And then someone decides to confront it, and by doing so exposes the vulnerability and weakness of that institution. As always, most people confuse this symptom with the cause. One of the things most often repeated throughout history is the surprise, the perplexity of people when they see that such a superpower fell so quickly, contradicting the established image of strength created by several generations, sometimes centuries. One of the great ironies of cultural decline is that it usually comes after periods of immense suffering. Prosperity removes the immediate pressures of survival, and it creates comfort, and that comfort, over time, breeds complacency. One of the most striking signs of a society in decline is the emergence of a new class of intellectuals. People who feel entitled to reinvent everything that previous generations built while producing very little of value themselves. They question the legitimacy of the very systems that gave them and guaranteed their privileges, romanticize the enemies, and demonize their own culture. They elevate feelings above facts, intentions above results, and resentment above gratitude. They see themselves as superior, looking down on traditional culture and ordinary people. In their boredom and lack of things to do, they end up creating problems, believing that nothing they do will actually destroy society. But history tells a very different story. No society can survive without strong institutions, and by strong, I don't mean authoritarian. From the most basic ones, which are the family, to the laws, education, religions, governments, and institutions, are only as strong as the values that support them. Today we see values being attacked exactly in the places where they should be defended. In schools, merit is dismissed as oppression. In the courts, punishment is replaced by therapy. In the media, outrage replaces analysis. Presenters and journalists are increasingly more concerned with giving their opinions, wrapped in a moralistic tone, than with delivering the news. In families, authority is ridiculed, and fatherhood has not only been trivialized, but has also become a target of attack. As Thomas Sowell once mentioned, the decay in American education did not begin with low test scores, but rather when schools stopped transmitting knowledge and started promoting ideology, when facts were replaced by perspectives, when discipline was replaced by self-esteem, and when excellence was redefined as elitism. And the establishment of this in the United States eventually spread to several other countries, especially in Europe and Latin America. In Brazil, Geraldo Alckmin, the current vice president and former governor of São Paulo, started this process of disintegration with continuous progression, which was replicated throughout Brazil in the following decades with the apocalypse. With the support of Partido dos Trabalhadores and Partido Socialismo e Liberdade, these are not small changes, they are tectonic shifts in the cultural ground. One of the most dangerous illusions in a decaying society is to believe that change always means something better, but not all change is progress. When the cultural values that made a society functional are discarded in the name of novelty or trends, the result is not liberation, but rather decay. Civilization is not man's natural state, it was an achievement and a fragile one. It is built slowly, at great cost, and is only preserved through restraint, discipline, and moral clarity. When these things stop being taught, when every tradition is questioned and every standard is deconstructed just for the pleasure of bored intellectuals, then it's only a matter of time before society starts to unravel. You don't have to look further than crime. In many Brazilian and Latin American cities, and even North American and European ones nowadays, violent crime is on the rise. And not because of a lack of money or jobs, but because of a lack of law enforcement. The laws are not enforced. Offenders are coddled, police officers are demonized while following orders that are always unfair and sometimes illegal, given by suit-wearing officials in offices who have never set foot on the streets. The result can only be disorder, and even though people suffer the consequences, intellectuals make excuses. They say the system is broken. No. I don't deceive a lançanismo. The verb that but to chaos, and once that chaos takes root, restoring order is not easy at all, and this cultural decline, it's not a mystery because it follows historical patterns, it has warning signs, and the most obvious sign is when truth becomes negotiable because it might offend someone when facts are subordinated to feelings. When standards are dismissed as arbitrary, when moral judgments are replaced by moral relativism. Thus, complacency, accommodation, and the lack of a common goal can lead civilizations to decline. On the other hand, we already have historical support to see how to avoid this. From the moment we look at history, we see that the brightest periods happened precisely when civilizations were not necessarily at war, but rather united around a common goal, something that often overcame their differences. So war, sometimes in some cases, made these peoples, these political groups, set aside their differences and unite around a goal. But it's not war that translates into this scientific drive, it's the purpose. When humanity sets a goal, a purpose, or the civilization in question does, it will probably progress and develop. So again, it's not war, but rather this purpose that unifies the internal differences within civilizations or the differences between civilizations. The anthropologist Joseph Enrich, whom I've already mentioned here on the channel, shows a fundamental advantage of cooperation. Notice that in prehistory, Neanderthals were possibly smarter than us, taller and stronger, but they ended up defeated by time. Because unlike them, Homo sapiens, our ancestors, knew how to work better in groups. But of course, we don't need to go that far back in history. Because it makes it clear, very clear, how societies that are able to establish shared and clear goals in peaceful and collaborative contexts are the ones that achieve great cultural and technological advances. And it is precisely peaceful cultural and institutional alignment, more than conflict, that generates lasting innovations. And here we return to what I mentioned at the beginning of the video. During the Cold War, there was a very strong competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. One had the main goal of overthrowing the other, of winning the Cold War, mainly through the technological race. This made them have a common goal within their societies that allowed for this great technological development. However, alongside this fierce competition, there was cooperation. As I mentioned, there was a certain respect from the Soviets towards the Americans and from the Americans towards the Soviets, mutual, even though they hated each other. In a way, at the time, there was also a certain admiration for each other's scientific achievements. If you look at the newspapers from that time, you'll see that there was a certain envy, but it was a respectful envy, let's say, like it could have been us who achieved that. It's something where they put aside their differences and started to admire each other, in very specific aspects. Obviously not economic or military, but in the scientific achievements that were being made, especially around the space race. However, with the end of the Cold War, this became more problematic. Not only did Russia now have the goal of staying alive, of rebuilding itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the United States also had a problem, a major identity crisis. And now, what is the role of the United States? This was reflected even in NATO. What is the role of NATO, which was created to stop a hypothetical Soviet Union invasion in a world where the Soviet Union no longer exists? This post-Cold War role of NATO has always been a problem, because they even suggested several times that NATO should be discarded. Of course, now with the war in Ukraine, this issue has kind of resurfaced, but still not as strongly as it was during the Cold War. So, the lack of purpose after the Cold War is also one of the reasons we might be seeing this technological slowdown after the 1990s. And it will probably continue for some time unless a new purpose arises that, once again, encourages civilizations to cooperate around a common goal. So no, it's not war that drives technology and the development of civilization, but cooperation around a great goal. And this is more noticeable during wars because that's when the population comes together around a goal to be achieved, which in this case is to win the war. But confusing war as the driving force with cooperation as the driving force is like confusing cause and effect. It's like confusing rain with rain clouds, like confusing the first as the cause of the second. But the second is not the only possible result, because just as not every time we have rain clouds we will necessarily have rain, not every time we have cooperation do we have war, and not every time we have war will we have cooperation. As the historian Yuval Harari pointed out in his book Sapiens, Homo sapiens did not dominate the world by being physically stronger, nor by being more intelligent than the Neanderthals. The crucial difference was the ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers, and this cooperation did not arise from war, but from the unique ability to create shared goals such as religions, myths, ideologies, and projects. It was this ability that sustained empires, civilizations, and even scientific revolutions. And nothing prevents this same mechanism from being used in times of peace if there is a clear purpose, discipline, and a solid culture. The problem then is that when society loses its greater objectives, or worse, starts attacking the very foundations that gave it cohesion. Because of this bored intellectual elite, cooperation falls apart and, in its place, comes resentment, ego disguised as virtue, and ideology masquerading as progress. It is not the lack of resources that destroys civilization, nor its external enemies. It is the loss of purpose that, in turn, makes room for the cultural degeneration that corrodes civilization from within. Well folks, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Share the video to help the World Geopolitics channel simply keep existing. It may seem like a small thing, but the fact that you share it on other social networks helps a lot. The YouTube algorithm makes the channel appear in searches, so you end up helping a lot with that. And if you really like the channel and want to make sure that this kind of content, which is very niche and won't attract a large audience, keeps being made, become a member depending on the category you choose. Not only will you get early access and exclusive videos from exclusive series like the Geopolitics of the Mongol Empire, for example, but also other videos and live streams with me. But, depending on the category, your name will appear here in the final list, or you'll be able to vote on the next video to be made here on the World Geopolitics channel, so become a member. On top of all that, you make sure the channel keeps surviving. Hugs, and see you in the next video. Bye.